on Writing Military History with Michael Lee Lanning, author of 30 nonfiction books printed in 12 languages, who has appeared on major television networks as expert on the individual soldier.
Thank you for joining me in episode 1 of On Military Writing. What I want to cover today is how I got in this business, how the publishing business has affected me, and how I hopefully have affected it a little bit. And mostly I'll talk about my background today. In episode 2, we'll go into my first books, and in later episodes I'll talk about the more recent books, and then we'll swing it around and get all the whole 30 books in here before we finish all the episodes. I was fortunate or unfortunate enough to be raised on a small West Texas ranch. I kind of hesitate to call it a ranch because we really couldn't afford to have horses. We herded the cows on foot. Because of our lack of income, we rarely were able to afford to have books in the house. But I soon found in my schools, the school library, and most importantly during the summers, my mother went to town once a week to do her laundry and grocery shopping. Across from the grocery store was the public library. While she shopped for groceries, I would go in and get as many books as I could carry. In fact, my first official identification was the ID card and public library card from the Sweetwater Public Library. By the time I finished my lower grades of school and started college, I was looking to try to get out of that part of the country and get to see more of the world. Texas A&M provided an education and also provided an aspect of being able to get into the military service. While at Texas A&M, I got C's in my freshman English classes, although really at that time those were considered fairly acceptable grades, especially for someone wanting to be a soldier, maybe not for a writer. In my second year, I took a journalism class, and this was very important that I learned to write the way and nonfiction characteristics. During those classes, I published in the campus newspaper, The Battalion, and also wrote for the agricultural department magazine called The Agriculturalist. By the time I graduated from Texas A&M, I already determined that I thought that a military career might be the best way for me to do and accomplish my objectives. I really didn't have much choice because this was 1968, and with the Vietnam War coming on, it was pretty much of a given that I was going to be in the military anyway. After graduation and commissioning, I prepared to go in the Army. I did my initial training. Right before my departure to Vietnam, I asked my brother, who had just returned from the war zone, for his advice. He advised me to keep a diary. Well, I kind of laughed and said, well, I'm an airborne ranger and teenage girls keep diaries. And he said, well, keep a journal. And he went out with me to a local bookstore, bought me a blank journal, and I put it in my pack. And for the next year, I wrote about 100 words a day on what my experiences were and what I thought about them. When I got home after a year in Vietnam in the early 1970s, I determined, like many soldiers returning, that I could write the great American novel about war. I sat down to write that great American novel. I wrote a couple of chapters, and then I reread it. It came across something like somebody that was trying to imitate Charles Dickens, Larry McMurtry, and possibly Dr. Seuss. It didn't work. I recognized very quickly that I was not a novelist, but I thought I was a pretty good soldier, so I decided to stay in uniform and continue to pursue staying in the Army. After a few more years in the Army and a tour in Germany, the Army offered many of us with good combat records to go to graduate school. A good combat record being defined as we'd survived the war. My choice was to go back and study journalism and be in public relations for the Army. At that time, public relations for the Army was something like being public relations for a used car salesman, garbage pickup people, or even television evangelists. We just weren't very popular. So it looked like a challenging field, but more importantly, I saw that I could get a master's degree. At East Texas State University, I studied journalism, and the two most important things was I was given one class where I could pick a topic and do pretty well anything I wanted to. And what I did was assemble what I thought was a pretty good idea of a book of Civil War quotations. When I finished it, I not only got an A in the class, but I started sending it off to publishers. 3 or 4 months later, after more than 50 rejections, I decided maybe I was not a nonfiction writer either. The second important thing that I did in graduate school, though, was they encouraged me to write a thesis. In that thesis, I learned that no one can write 100 pages or 200 pages or 300 pages, but all of us can write 2 pages a day. And if we do that every day, within a matter of months or a year, we have a book, or in this case, a master's thesis put together. Upon the completion of my graduate school, I returned to the Army. As a public affairs officer and alternating as an infantry officer, I wrote articles for both civilian and military magazines, and eventually wrote a weekly column in the Fort Lewis, Washington Ranger newspaper. The writing for periodicals and for newspapers fairly honed my writing and made me I like seeing my byline, and I like being able to put out some information I thought others might read. After a time of writing these articles, this was in the early 1980s, movies became very popular about the Vietnam War. Apocalypse Now, Platoon, others that showed what I knew was not true and had not really occurred and were falsehoods about the Vietnam War and the veterans themselves. I decided that maybe I could write something that would leave the truth about the war and its warriors. I was not ambitious or confident enough to think it would ever be published, but I thought that I would write my story, and if nothing else, I would Xerox 2 copies to give each of my daughters so they would be able to say, this is what my daddy did in the war. So I sat down and started writing. And we'll go into the next episode 2. I'll talk about where that writing led.
You can learn more about Michael Lee Lanning and his books at michaelleelanning.com.